Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Economics Weekly. There's a lot to talk about, but in a sense, we're sort of in between things. Last week, the budget speech was postponed, and we're currently waiting for Budget 2.0. Yesterday, the Treasury said that they've resubmitted their budget proposals and it's now at Cabinet, so we'll have to wait and see what happens. In the meantime, there are lots of rumors, and we can briefly speak to some of them. So the big sticking point in the budget 1.0 was that the minister was set to propose a 2 percentage point increase in the VAT rate. That additional money was supposed to pay for additional spending. When he presented the mini budget in November last year, he was budgeting for no real increase in spending over the next 3 years. Government would have spent a bit more in nominal terms, but not in real terms, and there would have been a cut in government spending in practical terms, and we would have seen that impact. Now the minister's proposing a budget where there's a real increase in spending, but to do that, you can't only reprioritize. If you're really going to spend more, you also need to get some revenue somewhere. And that's where the 2 percentage points came from. He did have ideas about how to cushion the blow to poor households in the South African community. VAT is regressive, so poor households pay a bigger share of their income when the VAT rate goes up. And you don't want that. You want to cushion them somehow. But all that was drowned out in the outrage of a tax increase. And we know that the DA has said that they'll oppose any tax increase, even in Budget 2.0. So we'll see what the minister and cabinet as the overarching governance of the GNU is going to come up with. There's a lot of talk about reprioritization of spending, and added onto that, a proper review of spending later in the year. Even though the government's been cutting spending for some time, it seems that there's still some fat in there. And it's possible to save some money when you start cutting advertising, catering, travel, etc. So that's coming up. In the meantime, I don't think it's particularly useful to be too worried about the proposals that are mentioned in the media. This week there was mention of a wealth tax. I think the chance of the implementation of a wealth tax is low, simply because it takes a lot of work to introduce a new tax. Tax experts need to get together. They need to talk to accountants, and there's a process in proposing a new tax. If there were to be any tax changes, it would be a change to something within the current system. Welfare taxes are in and of themselves quite tricky, mainly because you have to decide, how do you define wealth? In the few cases where welfare taxes are used internationally, they typically say that they look at property, like fixed property, residential property. They also look at financial assets, so the shares that you might hold, or money in bank accounts. And they could also look at jewelry, art, vehicles, things like that. But determining those values are not straightforward, particularly when you get to jewelry and art and vintage cars. Added to that, you need to tax the net value of those assets. So it might be that you have a nice and fancy house, but if it's really owned by the bank, then your wealth that's supposed to be taxed is a lot less. So throughout the world, in the few places where this is used, Norway, France to some extent, Spain has something of that. The rates are very low. The cutoffs are really high, and wealth taxes earn a very little bit of income for their revenue authorities. So the chance of that filling up the gap in our budget sustainably is very low. So we'll see what the minister comes up with, and I think there's an interesting week ahead before we get to budget week again. Yesterday also saw some CPI inflation numbers, the January numbers, and it's the first time that they're applying the new basket items and the new weights. Within that, there were not a lot of interesting changes. Inflation went slightly up from December to January, from 3% to 3.2%. And the items that increased was basically housing and utilities, which is mainly electricity. There was a little bit of an increase in food prices, but it was items like fish and seafood, sugar, confectionery, desserts, baked goods, Hot drinks also increased, but that's mainly coffee. So no broad-based increase in food prices to worry about at the moment. Some prices only get surveyed once a year, and we saw that in, for example, the increase in the price of insurance, which went up by 8%. So overall, inflation is slightly higher, but still low and safely below the midpoint of the Reserve Bank's target range. So unlikely to influence the Monetary Policy Committee's decision later in March. They're more worried about what's happening internationally. So we know that President Trump imposed tariffs on his neighbors, Mexico and Canada, but later postponed them with a month. That month's passed, and the discussion around those are again coming up in early next week. So that's going to be interesting. And if you look at US job numbers and US inflation pressure, we'll be following the lead of the US Fed in probably maintaining current interest rates, waiting to see how all the trade disruptions play out and whether that's going to put upward pressure on prices, whether it's going to strengthen the dollar. We'll have to wait and see. Those are the big items of economic news at the moment. Tune in next week where we talk a bit more about what's happening in the economy. And yeah, please like, share, and comment.